Welcome back to Boss Economics World, where we slice through the economic nonsense with a chainsaw of truth. I'm your host, the guy who's been yelling about government mismanagement since the Fed started printing money like it's monopoly cash. Today, we're diving headfirst into the Trump administration's latest economic faceplant, the pause on their pie-in-the-sky sovereign wealth fund, all while the U.S. debt spirals toward $36 trillion and counting. Buckle up, folks, because this is a masterclass in how to dodge reality while waving the growth flag. Let's break it down, from the shiny promises to the gritty economic mess behind it, and trust me, it's a doozy. So, here's the deal. Back in February 2025, President Trump strutted out with a grand plan to create one of the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds. We're talking a trillion-dollar beast, supposedly fueled by monetizing government assets, whatever that means, and investing in flashy projects like critical minerals or even a stake in TikTok, because nothing screams economic stability like owning a chunk of a dance app empire. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Wall Street darling turned Trump cheerleader, boldly claimed this fund would be up and running in just 12 months. Fast forward to May 23, 2025, and in a Bloomberg interview, Bessent basically said, yeah, about that, it's on pause. Why? Because Trump's laser-focused on paying down the national debt instead. Cue the laugh track. Now, if you're new to Boss Economics World, you know we don't just swallow this kind of flip-flop without asking the tough questions. Why did this grand plan crash and burn? And what does it tell us about the economic dumpster fire the U.S. is sitting in? Let's peel back the layers, from the surface-level PR stunt to the deep-rooted economic issues that make this pause a symptom of a much bigger problem. First off, let's call this what it is, a classic political distraction. Trump's sovereign wealth fund was pitched as a game-changer, a way to flex U.S. financial muscle by investing in strategic assets and maybe even chipping away at the national debt. But as Bloomberg News reported, the plan slammed into a brick wall of legal, financial, and political realities. Translation: it was never gonna happen. The idea of monetizing federal assets, like selling off public land or infrastructure, sounds sexy until you realize Congress would have a collective heart attack. And borrowing more to fund it? That's like trying to fix a leaking boat by drilling more holes. The administration's pivot to a simpler investment vehicle that doesn't need congressional approval is just lipstick on a pig. Instead of a trillion-dollar fund, we're talking about merging existing agencies like the Exim Bank and the Pentagon's strategic capital into some half-baked oversight office. This isn't a sovereign wealth fund, it's a bureaucratic shuffle to save face. Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, tasked with delivering this fantasy within 90 days, reportedly submitted a plan so unrealistic that even the White House, not exactly known for fiscal restraint, sent it back to the drawing board. This isn't just a policy oopsie, it's a symptom of a government that loves to promise the moon but can't deliver a street lamp. And while Bessent's out there saying Trump's laser-focused on paying down the debt, the numbers tell a different story. Let's talk about that national debt, shall we? As of May 2025, the U.S. debt is clocking in at a jaw-dropping $36 trillion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 124% at the end of 2024. That's not just a big number, it's a screaming red flag that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, as Bessent himself admitted on X posts. Yet, in the same breath, he's brushing off concerns about the debt, claiming a Republican tax bill, which would raise the debt limit, will magically create growth and shrink the debt-to-GDP ratio. Sure, Scott, and I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Here's the math. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that the GOP's budget bill could add $3.3 trillion to the debt over the next decade. Meanwhile, Bessent's banking on GDP growth north of 3% by May 2026 to fix everything. But the Commerce Department just reported that Q1 2025 GDP contracted due to a rush of imports to beat Trump's tariffs. Private economists are now whispering about a heightened risk of recession later this year. So, where's this 3% growth coming from? Thin air. TikTok ad revenue. This is classic government sleight of hand, promise growth to justify more borrowing, while ignoring the structural issues dragging the economy down. The debt ceiling, which Bessent says could be hit as early as August 2025, is another ticking time bomb. He's urging Congress to raise or suspend it by mid-July, but with lawmakers bickering over a budget that's already ballooning the deficit, good luck getting that done before the summer recess. Now, let's zoom out to the real economic issues this fiasco exposes. The Trump administration's obsession with flashy ideas like a sovereign wealth fund or massive tax cuts is just a symptom of a deeper disease, a government addicted to spending, borrowing, and kicking the can down the road. The U.S. economy is teetering on the edge, and here's why. 1. The debt-to-GDP trap. At 124%, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio is higher than most similarly rated sovereigns, which is why Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA1 in May 2025. Bessent called Moody's a lagging indicator, but that's just denial dressed up as bravado. A lower credit rating means higher borrowing costs, which means more debt to service, which means less money for actual growth. It's a vicious cycle, and the administration's plan to grow our way out is like trying to outrun a tsunami. 2. Tariff tantrums. Trump's tariff policies, which Besant defends as reciprocal trade measures, are already backfiring. The Q1 GDP contraction was driven by a flood of imports as businesses scrambled to avoid new tariffs. Besant claims Walmart will absorb some of these costs, but he's also admitted some will hit consumers. Higher prices mean inflation stays sticky, which means the Fed might not cut rates as Besant hopes. And if rates stay high, borrowing costs for households and businesses climb, choking off the very growth Besant's banking on. 3. Recession risks. The Commerce Department's report of a Q1 contraction isn't just a blip, it's a warning. Private economists are now pegging the odds of a recession in late 2025 at over 50%. Add in the debt ceiling drama, and you've got a recipe for economic chaos. Senator Chris Murphy, D-Con, called the Moody's downgrade a big deal that could push the U.S. toward recession. Yet, Besant's response is to double down on tax cuts and deregulation, hoping for a growth miracle that's nowhere in sight. 4. Political gridlock. The sovereign wealth fund's collapse shows how dysfunctional Washington is. The original plan needed congressional approval, which was never going to happen with a divided Congress. Now, the pivot to a simpler vehicle is just a way to bypass lawmakers altogether. This isn't leadership, it's a tantrum. And with the debt ceiling looming, the odds of a government shutdown or default are climbing, which would tank markets and consumer confidence. Here's the bottom line, folks, the Trump administration's economic playbook is a house of cards built on wishful thinking. Pausing the sovereign wealth fund isn't a strategic retreat, it's an admission that the plan was half-baked from the start. And pivoting to paying down the debt while pushing a tax bill that adds trillions to it. That's not fiscal responsibility, it's fiscal schizophrenia. For our viewers, whether you're a regular Joe worried about your grocery bill or a finance pro crunching numbers, this should set off alarm bells. The U.S. economy is drowning in debt, with a debt-to-GDP ratio that's among the worst in the developed world. Tariffs are jacking up prices, and the Fed's in a bind because inflation's still hovering around 3%. Meanwhile, the government's solution is to keep borrowing and pray for growth that's looking less likely by the day. If you want a real fix, here's what we need: cut spending, not just talk about it, reform entitlements, which eat up 60% of the federal budget, and stop pretending tariffs are a magic bullet. Norway's sovereign wealth fund works because they've got oil revenue to back it, not a $36 trillion debt hole. The US isn't Norway, and no amount of TikTok stock is gonna change that. So, what's the takeaway? The government's selling you a fairy tale about growth and prosperity while the debt clock ticks louder than ever. Don't fall for it. Check out the numbers yourself. The Congressional Budget Office, the Commerce Department, even posts on X are screaming about the debt crisis. Stay informed, hold these clowns accountable, and maybe, just maybe, we can stop this economic train wreck before it's too late. That's it for this episode of Boss Economics World. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with anyone who needs a wake-up call about the mess in Washington. We're here to keep it real, no matter how ugly the truth gets. Until next time, keep your wallet close and your skepticism closer. Peace out.